Welcome to Module 4 of U.S. History 1302. This module will cover chapters 22 and 23. We're looking at the New Era and we're looking at the Great Depression New Deal. The New Era is also known as the Roaring Twenties. This is the era following World War One, where the United States will enter a period of isolationism and a period of rapid cultural change thanks to events that have taken place during World War One and in the decades prior. So, starting with the 1920 election, we have a new president, Warren G. Harding. He will end up winning the 1920 election against Democrat James Cox, who was very much a continuation of Wilsonian progressive ideals, while Harding was very much a return to pre-World War One ideals, back to normal, or as he's most well known for saying, a return to normalcy, a return to America caring about America, America first, or a return to isolationism. He also wants to lower taxes, restrict immigration, and in general, have more pro business ideals. A return to laissez faire and lack of business regulation. This is kind of a return to what we had been doing prior to the progressive era. And he will end up winning. And so his vice president, Calvin Coolidge, and him will begin a period of Republican control of the presidency that lasts all the way until the 1930s. We are focusing on America. We are becoming more isolationist. We're turning away from the rest of the world, against the League of Nations, against business regulation, and also against the advancements made by unions and labor. It doesn't take long before the Harding administration is in a terrible scandal. This happens when it's discovered that the Minister of the Interior, Albert Fall, is found to have taken bribes in 1923. It was discovered that Secretary Fall had taken bribes now worth millions of dollars in order to allow oil companies access to private reserves that had been designated only for the U.S. Navy, and at the time was a major scandal. The only perhaps good thing for Harding is that he died before the scandal came out. And so his vice president, Calvin Coolidge, will have to deal with the blowback as he becomes president when Harding dies in 23. And he basically goes, I didn't know anything about this. And the only person who ends up, let's say, taking the fall is the Department of the Interior Secretary, Albert Fall. So he will run for reelection in 1924, again, continuing on very pro business, isolationist, small government ideals. He is also very famous for the quote, the chief business of American people is business. So again, he's very Republican, lower taxes, no unions, high tariffs. And under his presidency, the United States will experience rapid economic growth. But as I kind of already alluded to when I talked about the chapters that we're covering, that will not last. In this instance, Calvin Coolidge will do probably less than most other presidents, certainly less than we would expect from a modern president. He'll have only one major piece of legislation that is passed during his presidency, which is the Indian Citizenship Act. This law will make all Native Americans born in the U.S. citizens and able to vote, so they have a greater say over the government, and they hoped this would help reduce the terrible inequality that Native Americans have faced since America began, as Native American reservations are some of the poorest and least developed places in our nation. And unfortunately, that has continued to this day. It's also during Coolidge's presidency that farmers will begin to suffer greatly because of the collapse in farming prices following World War One. where a bunch of farmers will buy machines and take on a lot of debt in order to produce more food, which is great during wartime. But after the war is over, it causes the price of crops to drop incredibly. And so many farmers are unable to pay back their debt. And that will lead to basically a recession among the farmers. But Coolidge, being a Republican, does not want to get involved. He will be involved in one of our many entrances into into Central America. In this instance, Nicaragua, which, like so many other of our interventions, is all about protecting our American economic interests. This is what's part of the known as the banana wars, is we have fruit companies that rely on these tropical areas to grow their fruit, which are not able to be grown in the United States. And so when we have to start occupying in 1912, Coolidge will end up pulling the Marines out in 1925, but sending them back in 27 in response to rebellion led by Augusto Sandino against the American occupation, and will be criticized for our attempted control of Nicaragua. But this is, again, one of many times that the U.S. is involved in invading Central America in order for our own interests. We also did the same in Cuba, Hawaii, and other areas around the world. It's during this time, following World War I, that women get the right to vote. And so now it becomes this question of, well, what's next? Now that women have the right to vote, what should these suffrage groups, what should these women's rights groups focus on next? And one of the big pushes is the Equal Rights Amendment. This was introduced in 1923, designed to end legal distinction between men and women and guarantee equality under the law. This will lead to a split in some women's groups. Among the more conservative, there is this idea that no, that women have got the right to vote. That's all they need. We don't need anything else. And to gain this equality could lead to, as some would say, that women would be able to be drafted and they would lose any sort of protective legislation. And one of the main splits in this is among working class and professional women. So there are women who did not want this to be passed, even though it ostensibly would give them more rights, because they believed that either it would make them have to do the same thing as men or they would possibly be drafted. There is this big push for women to kind of go back to taking care of the family. There is this a similar push following World War II. And ultimately, the Equal Rights Amendment will not be ratified because of this split. Instead, during the 1920s, female liberation is turned away from getting rights and more towards this new thing that's entering our society, this idea of consumerism and consumption, that now women can consume and buy things and get entertainment just like men. They have equal access to goods. We now have entire industries popping up designed specifically to appeal to women, both in areas of fashion and in areas of labor saving devices in the home, things like vacuum cleaners, washing machines, dishwashers, all of these things designed to make the life of the woman easier. And again, this is in exchange for this push for greater rights or greater political or economic radical ideas. This is a return to how things were, but now we have washing machines. Now we have electricity. Now we have sliced bread, which is only about 100 years old. And so, because of that, you also have this desire to sell it. And we get the first advertising in the 1920s really takes off. We are, of course, today used to seeing ads everywhere, but this was not the way it was back then. And so we have an interest of a couple different advertisements around here. Wonder cut bread, it's sliced. Oh my God, that's an amazing thing. One of the biggest places you could buy this thing, basically the Amazon of its day, was the Sear Roebuck company. You could get a giant magazine in the mail, and it would have a catalog of all the things that you could possibly buy from them, and you would order it over the phone, or you would order it from the Sears and Roebuck company, and they would ship it to your house. And again, it completely changed the way we buy things, the way we attain things, and want and entire the entire advertising industry pops up during this period to become one of the major pushes in our world. And one of these is the Gain a Day washer, which is promising to emancipate women from the slavery of laundry at home. It also has a built-in ironer. Oh my goodness! Instead of having to spend 2 days doing laundry, now you only need one. You also have this big push about buying stuff, about this American standard of living, and how instead of trying to fight for more rights, instead, by getting this greater standard of living, by getting things like a telephone, a radio, a washing machine, a refrigerator, or a new car, then you are able to get that level of fulfillment that might otherwise have been towards learning new things or gaining more rights or gaining greater positions. And it's all about developing things that are make it easier, that allow us to spend more time on leisure activities. The expansion of credit means that we can buy more things, and this idea that what it means to be American is not necessarily about rights anymore. It's about buying stuff. It's about having the newest and greatest thing. That's what makes you an American, this greater standard of living. And a lot of the companies that we are used to these days, companies like Coca Cola, companies like Ford, and General Motors, and other companies will arise during this period and become national and world recognized brands thanks to advertising and thanks to consumerism. And this decade of prosperity will seemingly completely take over American culture for the next 10 years as we get more and more stuff and we're able to buy more and more stuff. But again, this is something that was only available to certain people, as thanks to the progressive era, there are people earning more money, and there are people who are protected in their jobs and people aren't as taken advantage of as they were. There are still many people who will never be able to buy a car, never be able to afford a refrigerator, or have this standard of living that is now being sold to Americans as essential. It's sort of our right as Americans to buy stuff. And many people didn't like this. Some of the most famous writers and authors during this period uh, did not like this consumerism. They did not like all this stuff that was going on in America at the time. So they will flee to places like Paris, where they will write books and poems and things like that. They talk about being disillusioned with democracy and peace and the prosperity of the Roaring Twenties. Um, and many of them moved to Paris because Paris has long been seen as a cultural center in the Western world. And one of the most famous authors during this time, F. Scott Fitzgerald, who wrote The Great Gatsby, which is all about how the American dream is an illusion the entire time. This man is trying to show how rich and powerful he is, and he's gotten rich and powerful in order to oppress a woman. And then, spoiler alert, he ends up dead in his pool. So you also have poets like Gertrude Stein, who was a patron of the arts in Paris and influenced people like Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald. Um, Ernest Hemingway is probably one of the more well known ones at the time, although less so recently. He was known for being an outdoorsman, being very adventurous. He had served in the war and was famously incredibly alcoholic. They all, pretty much all of this lost generation artists who moved to Paris were known to turn to hedonism, turn to drinking and food and sex and drugs, possibly, in order to deal with their disillusionment with the world. And many of them will not live very long because when you do that bunch of horrible things to your body like that, it's not good for not only your physical health, but your mental health, which is why um, Ernest Hemingway will end up committing suicide. But that helps turn him into this even somehow even greater cultural figure. We love a tortured soul. It is during the 1920s that we get the rise of what we would call a popular culture. For the most part, America and the world had been very cut off from the rest of the world. But now, thanks to the invention of the radio, thanks to the movie theater, people can now experience things in a way, in a cultural way, that had never been possible across the world. You get westerns and comedies heavily influenced by Wild West shows and vaudeville that became the most common genres. You also had movie theaters which had popcorn and air conditioning, which was a brand new invention, which was especially very important in places like the South where the summers were quite hot. You also have the development of the first sports teams. Babe Ruth was the most famous baseball player in the world at the time. You also have teams that we know of today that he played with: the Yankees, the Red Sox, the Braves. He was known as a slugging outfielder, and this is when a lot of our sports teams will come into existence that are very popular now. Of course, you have news and radio. This is made at first possible by radio, the golden age of radio. By the end of the year, by the end of the 20s, will be on pretty much every household, thanks to it getting cheaper and cheaper, and thanks to credit. You have news and weather updates, stocks updates, news about the world in a way that had never happened before, because you can get almost instantaneous news if something happens on the West Coast and it goes out of the radio, instead of having to wait maybe a week or days, or prior to the invention of the railroad, even months to get news from the other side of the country. Now can be transmitted in a matter of minutes. And so this is very important for the creating a unified country, a unified culture. You also had this is the beginning of when, families started listening to the radio together, kind of like how families might listen or watch a movie or watch a TV show together now. They would listen to westerns and radio dramas. One of the most famous radio dramas was War of the Worlds, where this man with a very deep voice got on the radio and talked about how we were being invaded by Mars, and a bunch of people thought it was real because they didn't know any better at the time. And you also had some of the first movie stars. I had Charlie Chaplin on the previous slide. This is also Mary Pickford. This is the first instance of a famous actress really changing American culture with the way that she looked. She cut her hair short. She wore shorter dresses, showed off more skin, and that will heavily influence how women dress during this era. She's also America's first female movie star and founding member of the Academy of Motion Pictures, also known as the Oscars. And her style, especially her hair, will influence how women dress during this period. Women dressed like her were given the nickname of flappers. These were typically young girls living in the 20s. They typically lived in cities. They were known for their rebellious and independent lifestyles. Girls just want to go out and have fun. The city allowed them to live independently, allowed them to go to work, and allowed them to go to college. Instead of being stuck out on a farm in the middle of nowhere, they could actually get together with other girls and dance and party and drink and have fun. They began foregoing marriage and marrying later. And at first, this is considered, it's a bad thing to be a flapper, but eventually it sort of becomes this symbol, this thing you want to be now. Of course, women love to dress up like this. They're known for their short skirts, bobbed hair, cut very short, typically would wear felt hats. They like to drink and smoke and drive cars, which is, again, typically considered something very masculine, especially at the time. And again, they are rejecting female roles. Many of them, of course, tend to be young white women. But They are pushing for economic freedom much more than political. So they've already got the right to vote. Now they want to be completely independent of a man. At the time, though, many women were seen as completely attached to either their husbands or before that their father. And so they were sort of rejecting these and trying to create. So they were trying to create sort of their own identity separate from a man. And many rejected the traditional female roles of wife and mother, at least for now while they're young. While for especially much of Western history, women were kind of expected to immediately go from their father's house to their husband's house and raise their children. Now women were not getting married as early. They were having their jobs. They were living on their own. They were going out, drinking, partying, smoking, having fun and doing things that were traditionally not what women were supposed to do. There's this big fight between traditional and modern women. There's this fight of women having jobs. This idea when you have your own job, you can make your own money and you can make a lot more decisions for yourself. And because we asked women to help us during World War I, now a lot more women join the workforce. You have what today we would generally consider women's jobs, working clerical work like typing, telephone operators, stenographers, the people who, are in courtrooms and things like that. Many worked in garments and textile factories. Some worked as seamstresses. Obviously, teaching and nursing, which had sort of been a continuation of what we consider the caring professions or women, a continuation of what women would do at home for their own families. Some women would do professionally, either by being a nurse or by being a teacher. And it was generally considered to be a woman's job, especially in the early 20th centuries. Many were only allowed in certain jobs, and they typically got paid less than what men got paid, but it did grant them an increased level of independence than women had been able to have before. And with that independence comes changing in sexual values. So we have very early sexual revolution in the 1920s, where again, because women are not expected to immediately marry, they can go out and possibly date around, meet multiple men, get into different activities with different men. There's a lot of social mixing, hanging out with men and women, doing what's known as heavy petting, which is everything that leads up to sex. Women were also dancing and having a lot of fun. They were allowed to appear sexual, and like I said, drinking and smoking were quite in comment. And one of the things that made this possible was access to the first examples of birth control. Women were able to have sex without getting pregnant. And so that gave them a lot more freedom. You have people like Emma Goldman and Margaret Sanger that pushed for access to abortion, access to birth control in order to give women this greater control over their lives and this a chance to possibly delay becoming a mother. And so they didn't need to immediately get married. And they will also, as you can see in this picture here, like I said, start drinking and smoking and taking on wearing bathing suits, which was, again, something that women typically didn't do, and start dressing like men, rejecting these traditional values. After World War I, we talked about how many African Americans moved north for economic opportunity, which is an example of a pull factor. They're moving north for jobs, and they are moving in order to escape racism, violence, and Jim Crow laws. And many of them will congregate in ethnic neighborhoods up in the North and West, developing new cultures. The most well known of these is Harlem in New York. And it is from that we get what's known as the Harlem Renaissance, originally known as something else. It was named by Elaine Locke, and you can see what it was called up there. And it is a revival of African American music, art, fashion, literature, theater, and scholarship that was only made possible by people moving north. So, all these different African cultures, many of them have been almost completely cut off from their true culture, now had a chance to make their own because They did not know necessarily maybe what part of Africa their ancestors came from or what part of Africa they came from. Many of them were forced to convert to Christianity and were not allowed to carry on any traditional African beliefs or practices, but some do keep those in secret. They will join together and concentrate in areas of the South to create new music, new art, new fashion, literature, and scholarship. One of the most well known African American poets and activists during this time is a man named Langston Hughes, who created what's known as jazz poetry. He also wrote for a black newspaper called the Chicago Defender, where he challenged racism, stereotypes, and promoted integration. People like Langston Hughes argued that the Harlem Renaissance wasn't just a cultural movement, it was also a political and social movement that helped to show that African Americans could be so much more than what they had been allowed to be in our history and in our past. So you have, instead of one particular African culture, you have more of a pan African style, again, because there is not a lot of connection to their past, to where they came from. There is this just sort of variety of cultural style and elements. You have a lot of experimental genres of music like blues and jazz. While there are many works focusing on slavery and institutional racism, you also have a new emerging folk culture. You have one of the first famous black musicians, Louis Armstrong, who was very well known for jazz. You have African American art that features people of color for the first time, which was not normal even in the 20th century. Most art focused on white people, on the rich and well off. Now, these vibrant African artists were creating incredibly vibrant, colorful art that featured black people instead of only having them on the edges or as servants. Again, the thing that is most well known from the Harlem Renaissance is, of course, jazz music, heavily influenced by the New Orleans scene, combination of big brass band, ragtime blues, heavily improvised. It broke the rules of traditional music. It was very disjointed, and many people absolutely hated it, especially uh, anybody who had studied music before, classical musicians. Many even saw it as a threat to society and culture, even though it became so heavily popular and so influential that many people call the 20s the jazz age. And it was just seen by some as decadent, promoting the decadent values of the 20s. Henry Van Dyke from Princeton University wrote that it's not music at all, just an irritation of the nerves of hearing, a sensual teasing of the strings of physical passion. Henry Ford thought that it was such a threat to white Western society that he introduced square dancing classes to schools across the US in order to try to prevent the spread of jazz. A lot of people, especially white people who had been culturally important and had great deal of influence over culture, were absolutely distraught by what jazz represented. Despite the fact that alcohol was completely illegal, that did not stop anybody from drinking. In fact, it led to a massive rise in organized crime as the 18th Amendment made it illegal to produce it. That meant that only criminals would be the ones who actually made alcohol, sold it, and transport it. So there was a big rise in organized crime. Cities quickly became places rocked with violence between these different organizations fighting to get control over the illicit alcohol sales. And so prohibition did not solve any problems and actually caused a great deal more. One of the places you could go during prohibition to get alcohol was in what's known as a speakeasy. This place, hidden bar where you are literally supposed to speak easy, don't be loud, otherwise the police might hear you. And where these underground bars where alcohol was sold and consumed, many of them again run by the mob. Moonshine runners, typically from the South, who would make moonshine, which is the type, very, very strong type of alcohol, usually made out in the woods, would then transport it to the cities. And they did a lot of car modification in order to outrun the cops. And eventually they decided, hey, let's see whose car is faster. And that's where we get NASCAR from. So moonshine will become very important in rural Americans. People who transported alcohol were typically known as bootleggers. Um, and as I said, many of them will modify their cars to outrun the cops. And the rise of organized crime from the mafia. Gangsters like Al Capone will use violence, intimidation, and bribery to gain control over certain cities, and the sale of illegal alcohol. It would make them incredibly rich and powerful. They'll buy off politicians and policemen in order to uh, look the other way and ignore what they're doing. There's a great deal of shootouts and gang violence between these different organizations. So again, prohibition did not solve any problems and only caused a lot more. And so it's very, very unpopular. And during the 1920s, we also have one of the worst instances of racial violence in our country. This is the Tulsa Race Massacre, 1921. This is something that was not talked about when I was in school. This is something that has only recently come to light because it was so thoroughly hidden in our histories. It takes place in what used to be known as Black Wall Street or the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma. This was considered one of the wealthiest black neighborhoods in the U.S. Up until 1920. There were black owned theaters, black owned businesses, doctor's office, churches. You had theaters and all these other businesses that were thriving. And unfortunately, that came to an end on May 31st, 1921. As was quite common across the South, you had a young black man, Dick Rowland, who was accused of assaulting a white girl in an elevator. He was a shoe shiner. He was being held at the Tulsa jail when rumors spread that he was going to be lynched. So a large group of white men had gathered around the jail. And in response, a group of African American men from Greenwood came in order to prevent the lynching. Once they arrived, these two groups began to fight. There was a scuffle, an exchange of gunfire, and that led 10 white men and two black men to be killed. News spread, which led to a bunch of mob violence. City officials will not be able to intervene. In fact, probably the opposite, and actually helped these rioters. They will completely destroy Greenwood, killing black residents, burning down their homes, looting businesses, and it's only the next day when the Oklahoma National Guard imposes martial law that the massacre is ended. This mob violence will be so destructive that over 35 blocks of homes, businesses, and churches are destroyed. Original estimates put it at only 36 people died. In reality, it's definitely several hundred. You also have 800 injured, and over 10,000 are left homeless. And as I said, this is not something that we knew about when I was in school because this was not even taught in Oklahoma's history until the year 2020. Nearly 100 years after it happened, after nearly everybody who'd witnessed it was already dead. As city officials and state officials work very hard to suppress news and report of this massacre, only coming to the light nearly 100 years later. It's during this time you have one of our early civil rights leaders, Marcus Garvey, and Garveyism, which was very popular after World War One. He was a Jamaican political activist who moved to Harlem in 1916. He created the UNIA. He was unlike Du Bois and others and Washington, who we learned about before. He was a black separatist. He did not believe that African Americans and white people could ever truly coexist. And so he advocated for self reliance and even this idea that Africans should leave America and move back to Africa, which also made him quite popular with the KKK and other white supremacist groups who were like, yes, absolutely, we want you to go back to Africa. Du Bois and other black intellectuals considered him a demagogue, much more interested in increasing his own popularity and putting himself on a pedestal. He would wear this made up military uniform and kind of push this idea of creating a not only an African American nation, which will happen. There will be a bunch of Africans who move back to America, back to Africa, and they form the country of Liberia, which is one of the only English speaking countries. It is the only African American country. Their flag is heavily based on the United States. And Garvey sort of uh, pretended to be this leader, this sort of pan African political figure until he is eventually deported back to Jamaica. So, looking at these three early civil rights leaders, we have Booker T. Washington, who told African Americans to move gradually towards equality, to get an education, work hard, and will found the Tuskegee Institute to help with that. Du Bois, who said, no, you need to demand equality now, and will use the law in the courtroom to help fight for that, found the NAACP, and focused heavily on getting an education. And then you have Garvey, who says, actually, equality is not possible. Instead, you need to focus on self reliance and potentially even go back to Africa. And one of the reasons why Garvey was so popular is because a lot of Black people felt that they had been betrayed following World War One, where they had moved north and they had tried to help with the economy and help keep things going, and even helped with the war effort. They had not really seen any gain of rights, or they had not seen any improvement following World War One. It's also during this time you get what's known as the National Origins Act. This is important for two reasons. First of all, it creates our modern visa system where instead of just showing up in America like you used to be able to, you now have to apply to come over here first before you come to the United States. It's also this that creates the uh, U.S. Border Patrol, and where we begin setting quotas on on basically where immigrants can come from. And so, if you are from a country that does not speak English or is not the right kind of Christian, then we're probably going to put a quota on or a limit on the number of people that come from your country. So again, we will allow a lot more people to come from Great Britain, Germany, than we will allow to come from Russia or Italy or any place like that, because again, they are not the right kind of white people. We also heavily, heavily limit any immigrants coming from China or Asia at all, as there is still that Chinese Exclusion Act and then what's known as the Gentleman's Agreement with Japan, where they do not come to the United States either. It's also during this period that there's this fight between traditional ideas and modern ideas. We are beginning to get a greater understanding of science and the universe and where we come from. And there are many people who see this as wrong, as this is bad. You have what's known as Christian fundamentalism, this idea that teaching evolution is wrong, that we have to ban evolution, we have to ban the teaching of modernism and secular ideals. And many places will found anti-evolution leagues that will seek to control what is taught to our children. You have preachers who talk about the dangers of exposing our young children to information, and how you have cartoons like this one that accuse education of leading people to disbelief of God and the Bible, and leading them towards Satan. And one of the greatest symbols of this is the fight over the Scopes trial. July 25, you have a substitute teacher in Tennessee who teaches evolution in school, and he is put on trial for breaking the law because it is illegal to teach evolution in Tennessee at the time. And this will attract people from all over the country, reporters who show up and see this as sort of this major fight and report on this. It gets nicknamed the monkey trial because, of course, this idea, it's a misunderstanding of what evolution actually is, that we didn't evolve from monkeys, but actually monkeys and humans evolved from a previous ancestor. And so, again, it's a slight misunderstanding of Darwin's theory of evolution or Darwinism, but It is what most people typically remember it as, is the monkey trial. The two people who were arguing this trial are Clarence Darrow and William Jennings Bryan. We've talked about Bryan before. He's one of our perpetual presidential losers who runs for president many times. And in this instance, he is the opposite of what he used to be. He used to be a progressive. In the past, Bryan had been the symbol of populism, of the future, of a changing way of democracy. But in this instance, he is actually fighting for traditionalism against modernism. And even though he will end up winning the case, he will actually be sort of pilloried in the press and viewed as old fashioned or stuck in the past, versus his opponent, Clarence Darrow, who is arguing on behalf of the American Civil Liberties Union that Scopes should be able to teach and that this is the violation of our laws and of the First Amendment. And so this fight between fundamentalism, Christian fundamentalism and modernism or secularism becomes sort of a national spectacle. Eventually, even though Scopes is found guilty, his fine is overturned. It would have been, he was fined $100, which would be about 1100 or $1,700 in today's money. Uh, Even though Brian ends up winning, he ends up looking very old fashioned and stuck in the past. And Clarence Darrow is usually considered the winner, but the spectacle was really a lot. And this became sort of a national trial that everybody paid attention to. And Brian will die shortly after. This was, I guess, just a little too much for him. So even though he is found guilty and fined, it is later overturned, and these laws will go out of fashion. And I'm sure you have taken at least one biology course that should have talked about evolution at this point. 19, our term is the Ku Klux Klan. It has been reborn since the end of Reconstruction, thanks to movies like The Birth of a Nation, canonized its origin story. They called the KKK as defenders of white civilization instead of what they actually were, which is a violent terrorist group intent on keeping African American former slaves down. These are not as focused on race. They are still definitely focused on race a little bit, but they're also much more focused on immigrants and Catholics and Jews and anybody who was not what they considered the right, again, the right kind of right and pretty much already here. So they were anti immigrant, anti Catholic, anti Semitic, and anything that was not traditional, what they considered white Christianity. And at one time, they were very, very large organization with millions of people throughout the U.S. Um, in fact, one of the largest groups was here in Dallas, and Dallas was what's considered the most racist city in the U.S. There was even a Klan Day at the Fair Park, which we saw a ticket to on the previous page. Membership was only open to native born Protestant white men. So you had to be born in America, you had to be Protestant, and you had to be a white man. No women, no people of color. This is much less violent than the earlier KKK, although there will be a number involved in lynchings. This is much more of a fraternal organization. They are anti union, anti immigrant, anti black. They are also isolationists. They just are generally do not want anything that the progressive movement recognizes. They do not like this changing black culture and the growth of jazz. They will bring back the Confederate flag, the quote unquote Confederate flag. This was never actually a flag used by the Confederacy. It was made popular by the Klan. Yes, also during this period, you have this push of the lost cause even more that we talked about before from Reconstruction. Nationwide, they'll gain up to 2 to 4 million people who are members. They will even at one point run a presidential candidate, but they will quickly fall off after 1925, after one of their major leaders is found to have caused his secretary to commit suicide. Such shock, someone who's racist and anti-immigrant and generally a terrible person would force somebody who works for him to commit suicide and just not be a nice person. So Though they sort of have fallen off, obviously they've never completely gone away. They still exist to this day. These images of them marching down the streets in places across the South, including Beaumont, Texas, Dallas, Texas, Fort Worth, many places like that. Even places like Houston will have large contingents of KKK members, but following the 1920s and 1930s, they will be forced, especially by the mid 20th century, they'll be forced back underground. They will not be nearly as public. You will not see people marching in hoods through the streets like they were in the 1920s, but the Confederate flag is here to stay as a symbol of Southern quote unquote heritage, even though it's not. And this sort of anti immigrant, anti racist feeling will continue up until the Great Depression and after until World War II. Our last Republican president for this period is Herbert Hoover. Hoover takes over after Coolidge declines to run again. He is benefiting heavily from the prosperity of the 1920s. He's against government regulation. He's a big proponent of what he called rugged individualism, that we do not need these progressive policies. We do not need government regulation or reform. He will also promise to crack down on crime and empower law enforcement. He'll also win thanks to some anti Catholic feelings against his opponent, Al Smith. At this point, we have had no Catholic as our president. We will not have the first Catholic president, will not actually be until the 1960s, and we've only had two out of 45 different presidents. There's only been two that have been Catholic. And you also have the fact that he was against prohibition. And so Hoover will easily win, and he'll take over when America is very, very prosperous. The stock market's doing great. Everything's fine. And so he does not need to get involved. Well, that's not going to last. So our last term for chapter 22 is speculation. This is basically what's known as gambling on the stock market. I'm going to borrow money. I'm going to use my entire life savings and buy stocks. And if I can't afford stocks, then what I'm going to do is what's known as buying on margin, where I will pay a certain amount of money for basically a piece of a stock. And then once the market goes up, then I can sell that stock, pay it off, and keep the profit for myself. I will borrow money, and then once that stock price goes up, I will sell my stocks and use that to pay the loans and keep the money for myself. And that's great as long as the stock market keeps going up. What could go wrong? Well, turns out a lot. The 1920s saw one of the longest periods of what we call a bull market, where the market is going up and everything seems to be going well, but we're about to enter a massive period of a bear market in the starting in 1929, which is also the beginning of what we call the Great Depression. Chapter 23, the Great Depression. This is going to talk about how things will happen after the stock market collapsed during this decade long period of incredible suffering in the United States. It completely changes how we interact with our government, what our government is expected to do. And we have the creation of what's known as the New Deal. As I previously mentioned in chapter 22, there's a massive drop in farm prices following World War One. And a lot of that has to do with mechanization. Thanks to the Industrial Revolution, you no longer need a team of people to do farming like you have in the top right corner. You can now do the whole thing yourself on the back of a tractor. Well, that makes it a lot cheaper to run things as long as you can afford the tractor. And so that will cause the price of farm goods and crops to drop. You'll also have many farm workers out of a job. And thanks to population growth in World War One, many farmers will put up their farm as collateral on loans used to buy these tractors, because if they didn't, they would not be able to compete with the low prices of other farmers or of mega corporation and large farming corporations. And in a way, this ends up causing sort of a race to the bottom where the price gets so low that now it's not even really worth it. And you cannot make enough money to pay back your equipment. And so many people end up losing their farms. Foreclosures skyrocket, and this will start in 1920, over 9 years before the Great Depression. But the farmers will be experiencing it all throughout the 20s. So while people in North and people in major industrial cities are partying it up and drinking and having fun, the people who grow our food are suffering. So, over speculation leads to the greatest stock market crash in our history. Over 90% of its value will be wiped out in a few years. This over speculation, this gambling on the stock market leads to prices that are completely not connected to reality, because the stock price is only going up because people want to keep making more money, and they keep putting more and more money in the stock market until people begin to realize this is bad. This gamble is not, there's too much risk. This is not tied to reality, and it could drop any moment. And so in October of 1929, some investors begin to get nervous. And so some begin to sell off their stocks. Well, then they go, well, that guy's selling off his stocks. I need to sell off my stocks. And it causes what's known as Black Tuesday, October 29th, 1929. Panic sets in, which causes a massive sell off during that day, causing stock prices to plummet, wiping out $14 billion dollars in a single day, meaning that many of the people who borrowed money and took out loans and bought on margin could not afford to pay off those loans. And so you also have many banks that have heavily invested money in the stock market. And it just sort of has this cascading effect where it causes a bunch of other problems. And the stock market will continue to crash for the next 3 years, wiping out over 90% of its total value by 1932, which is the height of the Great Depression. And so you have over speculation. And a lot of these banks that have invested money in stock market now don't have the money that they're supposed to have anymore. They've lost it all. So when you put your money in a bank, it doesn't just sit there. They don't, put the money in a safe and go, this belongs to this person. No, they take that money and turn around and loan it out to people. They invest in the stock market. They do all this stuff. And when people have loaned their money, when their money has been loaned out to somebody else and that person can't pay the bank back, then suddenly, if that person comes for their money and the bank doesn't have it, the bank closes. And if you haven't gotten your money out, it's gone. Your money's just gone. So even though a bank might say that, oh, well, we have, all these customers and they've given us $1 million, they're not going to keep $1 million on hand. They're only going to have a small part of that there. They're going to invest it. They're going to loan it out to other people and things like that. But when people see the banks, the stock market's crashing, they're worried about banks closing or the economy or stuff like that. So people run to the banks to get their money out, which causes banks to run out of money, which causes more people to freak out and run to the bank to get their money out, which causes even more banks to fail, and so on and so forth. And as I said, these news of bank failures and the stock market crash will cause even more crashing of the stock market and even more bank failures, and it just sort of ripples throughout the entire economy. And many businesses had money in the banks. You also had a lot of rich and powerful people who had their monies in banks. And if your money was in that bank, it was gone. Like we expect today that when we put our money in a bank that it'll still be there. But then it's just gone. So this meant that many businesses did not have money to pay people, that they did not have the profits that they were supposed to have to be able to grow their business. And so you have a rash of layoffs, closing businesses, and banks that only make things worse, that cause even more people to lose their jobs, that cause even more people to lose their livelihoods, which causes foreclosures, which means the bank can't get the money that it's supposed to get back from your mortgage, which causes even more bank failures. And so the entire economy just collapses. Less than a year into this, our president at the time, Herbert Hoover, decides that the best thing to protect our businesses is tariffs. And so he's going to introduce the largest tariff in our history, known as the Holly Smoot tariff, designed to protect American farmers and businesses, but it'll only end up making the depression even worse because many of these countries that we put tariffs on will go, fine, I'm going to put a tariff on you. And suddenly, all the stuff that we had produced that we now Americans could no longer afford to buy, we also couldn't send overseas because now they wouldn't buy them thanks to tariffs. And so that will only make everything so much worse. As I said, overproduction is another major cause of the Great Depression. It started with the farming industry, where we produced more than we could possibly ever use or sell, and we no longer needed to send it to Europe to feed Europe. Now that they can grow their own food again, and the war's over, and so you got a surplus of good. And with our capitalist market economy, when you have too much of something, that means that it's basically worth nothing. And so that leads to massive layoffs, drops in prices, rising unemployment, which turns around and means that now those people who had a job can't afford to buy things. They can't afford to buy cars. They can't afford to buy refrigerators or toasters or food. And so now the businesses that relied on that consumer spending now have to close, which even puts even more people out of business. And again, it's just this sort of cascade effect that makes things worse and worse. At the time, the government did not provide anything like we have today. There's no food stamps, there's no welfare, there's no unemployment insurance. And so many of these people who are suddenly out of a job are helpless. There are, of course, charity organizations that exist. We have settlement houses and soup kitchens and things provided by churches and other charities. But it's just way more than can be taken care of when you have, one out of, at the height of it, at the height of the Great Depression, 1 out of 3 people are unemployed. You have 20% of the country unemployed within the first year. And Hoover refuses to do anything in order to help. He, again, believes in rugged individualism and that people need to pick themselves up by their own bootstraps. And so just a few years after Americans are, living at the height, living their great lives, now they're sitting in bread lines waiting to pick up food for their families and relying on the charity of others. Many World War I veterans march on Washington. They're known as the Bonus Army. They had been promised a bonus in 1945 and they needed it early. There were 17,000 vets and their families who are in Washington to ask Congress to give them their bonus early. Instead of helping them, instead of helping these people who signed up to fight for a country, Hoover sends in the police and the army to break up the camp. And they will reject any and all, Congress will reject any and all bills in order to pay them early. So, again, not only is Hoover refusing to do anything to help, he's actually deliberately sending in, using the power of the government to attack those who are criticizing him. In the Great Plains, things will get so much worse when you have over farming mixing with drought and you have what's known as the Dust Bowl, because farming is literally taking resources out of the ground. When you plant stuff in the ground, it sucks the nutrients out of that soil in order to create whatever crop you're trying to grow. So it's very important for the soil to either be allowed to regain those nutrients or for you to plant crops that allow it to then you till back into the soil or let it rest. But because crops had crashed in prices, people were doing way over farming and it led the topsoil to dry out that would blow away in massive dust storms. And so you get these mile high dust clouds that would blanket entire towns and fields. And so even if other farmers weren't having these terrible farming practices, the dust would fall on and kill their crops. And so again, it just creates this massive ecological disaster, displacing over 3.5 million people by 1940 who are forced to take their entire families and try to escape to places like California. And traveling these traveling migrants were nicknamed the Okies. Um, and again, you can see images like here. They literally pile their everything they could possibly carry with them on their car and drive to California from places like Kansas, Nebraska, North Texas, and Oklahoma, which you might have guessed by the name Okies. One of our great authors during this period is John Steinbeck, who will write about the grapes of wrath, telling basically how what these migrants face. These are hardworking American farmers that have lost their farm and trying to move to California to a better life, only to be um, very much hated and disliked and suffer on their trip to try to improve their lives. One of the ways that we know about this terrible suffering, in addition to works like John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, is through the work of documentary photographer Dorothea Lange, who takes a lot of these pictures that we tend to think of about the Great Depression, including this famous picture of a migrant mother and her two sons, which we saw at the beginning, along with many others, who showed the human suffering that was existing during the Depression and how Americans were just kind of left to defend for themselves. So, business failures, farm foreclosures, massive layoffs lead to 25% of the working class unemployed. One in four don't have a job or can't find a job. That is, of course, for white people. For Black and Hispanic unemployment, the rates are much higher. As many as 50% of Black men looking for jobs are unemployed, as they are typically the first fired and the last hired back. You have millions of people who are homeless, who've lost their homes or evicted. By 1933, there were over 1,000 foreclosures a day, and many who were forced to become transient or hobos and live in shanty towns. And so you have images like this one, where you have a young man asking, "Why can't you give my dad a job?" An image of an old man traveling on the railroad. And then you have this world's highest standard of living. There's no way like the American way. And in front of it is a line of people waiting to get food for their starving families, because we had this great American standard of living. We had this great economy, but it has completely collapsed. And now we are struggling to even do the basics. That American standard of living is now gone. With this, you have the breakdown of families. You have, even though the divorce rate will plummet because it costs money to get divorced, you do have many men that will desert their families. There is many who go begging and or try to find jobs. Some never come back. The birth rate falls to an all-time low, because if you are struggling to feed yourself, then you're probably not going to want to pop out a couple of kids. And many women who are left behind will struggle to care for their families. There are massive increases in the rates of suicide and domestic violence. Um, there's a lot of men who commit suicide after they lose their jobs or if they lose money on the stock market, because, again, there's this emphasis put on men to be the provider. There are over 200,000 children who are abandoned or orphaned during this period. And again, Hoover is doing absolutely nothing. Less than a year after the start of it, he says the worst is behind us. It wasn't. Um, tells Americans to tighten their belts and to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. But of course, it's rich to tell people to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps when they don't have any boots. Refuses to give any aid to the unemployment and those in need, and because he feels like it will hurt our spirit of rugged individualism that made America so great, and so he will receive a lot of the blame for the suffering of Americans during this time. Many homeless will create shanty towns, these little villages or camps all over America, and they're nicknamed Hoovervilles, named after the president who received a lot of the blame and was seen as out of touch for refusing to do anything to help anybody. In fact, he was quoted as saying, in I believe in 1932, that no one has starved at a time when actually many people in his country are starving, and some have starved to death. And so he has refused to do anything to help, except he decides, hey, I know what'll help. Let's get rid of all these Mexicans that we brought in to help work our fields during World War One, and so we'll have what's known as Mexican repatriation or mass deportation. This is also mixing with rising nativism and anti-immigrant feeling, which comes, as I said, sort of comes back during the 1920s and will only increase during the Great Depression. We need American jobs for real Americans. And many will blame, and Hoover will blame Mexicans for making the Great Depression worse. And so we will just round up. You look Mexican, get on the bus, go back to Mexico. Many of the people we even round up are actual citizens. Anywhere between 40 to 60% are first generation immigrant citizens. But we don't care. We will deport 1.8 million Mexican Americans back to Mexico between 1929 and 1936. Some just put on trains and put on buses and sent back, thanks to that new Border Patrol, which we created during the 1920s. So, 1932, the country is suffering. The Depression is getting to its absolute worst point. And again, Hoover is saying, go back to work hard, get a job, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. I'm not going to do anything to help you. And not surprisingly, in the next presidential election, he loses because you have his opposite, another man named Roosevelt, the former governor of New York, who promises Americans a new deal that will provide relief, recovery, and reform to our economy. Although I shouldn't say that Hoover did nothing. He did give loans to banks and businesses, but nothing to the American people who are suffering. But it turns out banks and businesses don't elect the politicians; the people do, and so he will lose in a presidential landslide for Roosevelt as he promises this new deal and this help for Americans. He also promises to repeal the 18th Amendment and end prohibition. And so that's one of the things that he pushes for. Do your bit, repeal the 18th Amendment and elect Roosevelt. It will be ratified December 1933 after he is elected. It is the 21st Amendment, which repeals the 18th Amendment because the only thing that can get rid of an amendment is another amendment. It is ratified on December 5th, 1933. And that night, Roosevelt mixes what he calls the first legal martini in 13 years, 10 months, and 19 days. It wasn't actually illegal. It wasn't actually legal yet. And of course, we know that was probably not his first martini. It was just the first legal one. If you have trouble remembering the different amendments, again, it just so happens that the 21st Amendment is the same number, of course, as the actual age you have to be in order to drink, which is 21. As the governor of New York from 1929 to 1932, he will create a lot of government programs to deal with the Great Depression, and those will help guide his New Deal ideas as president. At 1939, he is left paralyzed through a disease we thought was polio. Now it turns out it might be something else. But his campaign and his wife will work very hard to sort of hide his paralysis. He will usually be either standing with braces or seated. So many people will not know that he is partially disabled because, again, Americans put a lot on how we view the president, and this idea that he might not be able to walk might make him look weak when we need someone who is strong and willing to help. His wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, the niece of Teddy Roosevelt and his first cousin, um, encourages FDR to return to politics despite his illness and becomes a very important advisor. She will completely change what it means to be first lady. She was not just happy to throw tea parties and dine with dignitaries. She will travel the country, meeting people and then reporting back to her husband. She will greet guests at the front door of the White House instead of a butler, just like you would a normal home. She'll even have the first press conferences, and she will allow only female reporters. She's the first lady to have a direct phone line installed in her office, which allowed people to call her from all across America, and she will completely redefine what it means to be first lady. One of the things that FDR does that no other president really does is what's known as the fireside chats. This idea that he is going to speak directly to the American people using this new medium of the radio. In the past, you might see the president's words written in the newspaper, or somebody might tell you what it is. If you're fortunate, you might see him on a campaign stop, but most likely you're never going to actually hear the voice of the president. But now, thanks to the radio, his voice could now be carried out to millions of Americans all across the country because most homes had a radio at this point, or cities would have, they would set these radios up in bars and other gathering areas. And this is where FDR tells the people of the country what he is going to do to help them and what he's going to do to make things better. His first one, his first fireside chat is telling them that they're going to close the banks from March 6th until March 9th. This is what's known as a bank holiday in order to basically, okay, we have everybody running on the banks and the banks are failing, so we're going to close them and make sure before they reopen that they have the money to survive. Otherwise, they will not be allowed to reopen. And so this is part of his New Deal. This idea of providing the three R's: relief, recovery, reform. So relief is, as it says, is to help the people of America who are suffering. There are programs like the WPA and the CCC, which provide jobs to the unemployed. Private charities, of course, are completely overwhelmed, so we need the government to help out. He will get a bunch of academics and economists and others to help him come up with policies to help the American people. They'll create the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, which will pass out $3.1 billion and employ 20 million people. The Progress Administration, or the WPA, will employ 8.5 million people to work on things like roads, bridges, schools, parks. They'll also have the Federal Arts Project, which will pay people like Dorothea Lange, who we mentioned earlier, and other sculptors and artists, because artists need to eat too and have a job. Civilian Conservation Corps will be created to employ young men, about 3 million of them, to maintain parks and forest reserves. In order to help recover the economy, we will pass things like the NRA, the National Recovery Administration, which will set prices and encourage fair competition. Also set for the first time a minimum wage, maximum working hours, and child labor. These are now laws, no longer just things that certain businesses could do or certain states. There's now national law that there is a minimum wage and maximum working hours. In order to help restart the housing market, which had completely stopped, we will create what's known as the Federal Housing Administration, or FHA, to help provide mortgages to people who cannot save up the 20% for traditional down payment. The Federal Housing Administration is still how many people buy homes today, because it's a lot harder for people to save up 20% when the median home price is over 400,000 in the US. So this will help you save up a lot less, like maybe 7% or 3.5%. Um, and this will help restart the housing economy. These also pass reforms to prevent another future catastrophe like this. The first one is the Glass-Steagall Act to prevent, to design, to cut off banks from Wall Street, where, because Wall Street can go up and down and and all this. One of the reasons why this was so bad is because banks were gambling with our money in order to make more money for themselves. They can't do that anymore. Well, until 1999, when Clinton repeals it. I'm sure nothing bad will happen 9 years after that. And then they also have the creation of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or FDIC. This is the reason why you now should feel safe putting your money in banks, because even if that bank fails, the government will provide insurance. So anything, if you have um, anything up to $250,000 in the bank now, it will be safe. So you'll see these little plaques if you go to a bank for the FDIC. They'll also pass the Securities and Exchange Commission, which regulates the stock market in order to prevent it from getting too big or possibly even closing the stock market if it begins to fall too much. To make people trust the stock market again and make investors be willing to invest in the stock market again, while the FDIC is designed to help people trust banks again. All of these are designed to increase consumer confidence and confidence in capitalism, as the New Deal is all about restoring the old system by putting in a little bit of reform and a little bit of government control over the economy and making the government responsible for Americans' well being. All of these things that he does, there's 77 major bills and 99 executive orders. These are all done within his first 100 days because he comes into office with a massive majority, what we call a super majority in Congress, which basically means that his party controls, I believe, over 2/3 or 3/4 of Congress, which means that they can pass anything they want, and they do. And so there's really no way to stop the Democrats from doing whatever Roosevelt wants, and so he passes all these laws that help try to make things better, and it's seen as, of course, such a opposite to what Hoover, which had done, which was nothing. And so even to this day, we still ask, people, what are you going to do in your first 100 days? Because that's when that is the time when you have the most political capital and when you can get the most done. And it's kind of hard to do things after that because you kind of get caught up in the normal running of society and your government position. Another one of the bills that he'll pass is the AAA, the Farm Relief Bill, or the Agricultural Adjustment Act, meant to boost agricultural prices and reduce surpluses. Again, this is a major shift from laissez faire. Paid farmers not to plant to reduce overproduction, also buy up surplus crops and livestock in order to raise prices. Again, this is Roosevelt going a little bit more populist, but also taking care of farmers and help building a coalition that will change the way that our parties vote and the way people vote and create what's known as the New Deal coalition. Not everybody agreed with the New Deal. Actually, some people, like Father Coughlin, believe that it didn't go far enough. Some, of course, argued that it was way too much power for the federal government and um, that Roosevelt was becoming too powerful. Father Coughlin, a famous radio priest, accused FDR of being too friendly to bankers. Louisiana Democrat named Huey Long came up with what he called a share the wealth plan, which would put 100% tax on fortunes exceeding $1 million. So you'd be able to earn your $1 million, but everything after that would go to the government in order to be able to be shared with everybody else. And he was assassinated in 35 before he could make a run against FDR because the Kingfish, as he was known, did a lot of wheeling and dealing, and somebody thought that basically they had been robbed of a position, so they killed him before he could run against Roosevelt. Another person who will push for greater reform is Francis Townsend, a doctor from California, who wants to create what he calls an old age revolving pension, which would give older Americans $200 a month. And it would allow them to retire and open up jobs for younger people who would then pay into that pension and allow them to um, pull that money out while the young people paid into it. Roosevelt does like this idea, and so he will put the Secretary of Labor, which is a new position that's created, um, in charge of it. Her name is Frances Perkins. She is the first female cabinet member, so the female head of a department of the government, but also close advisor to the president. She will help create this old age pension. Her position is created thanks to the National Labor Relations Act, or what's known as the Wagner Act. It's the first law that is designed to guarantee the right to form, join, and participate in a union, engage collective bargaining, and take collective action like strikes. It also creates the National Labor Relations Board, which is designed to handle disputes between employers and employees and enforce the NLRA. It is passed in 1935 by Roosevelt. It is part of what's known as the Second New Deal. Roosevelt is coming up on reelection, and so he wants to pass all of these laws to continue the prosperity and to try to keep rebuilding the economy and taking care of the people. The Social Security Act is going to be one of the next ones he passes. Like I said, this was created partially thanks to Francis Townsend, but also Francis Perkins. It will create the Social Security Trust and Administration, which is funded by payroll taxes. It provides monthly income to people over the age of 65. It's where we get Social Security numbers from. It also provides things like unemployment insurance, money for people who are disabled, and survivor benefits of those who are deceased. So if you're working in a job, you're going to pay into Social Security. It's 6% up to $150,000. And then over your career, you'll pay into that so that whenever you get to the age of 65, you're able to retire. And then now you can access the money from that pension. And if, let's say, you are a stay-at-home wife or mother, and your husband works and pays into Social Security but dies, you are able to withdraw basically what he would have had or part of it through survivor benefits, so you can still survive. And the first woman to get this is actually Ida Mae Fuller. She received Social Security check 001 because she had never worked outside of the home. And so she got survivor benefits. And it will drastically lower poverty rates among the elderly. But sort of as you'll see with this New Deal and a lot of Democratic policies during the time, they are exclusionary to people of color, as agricultural and domestic workers will be excluded from Social Security benefits. And these are areas that were typically worked by Hispanic and by African American workers. And unfortunately, like I said, this is not the only place that that will happen. 1936, you have another election where Roosevelt wins in a landslide. He is very much boosted by the support for the New Deal programs. His opponent, who Landon, was against the New Deal for being too wasteful and inefficient, but he will end up winning 98.5% of the Electoral College. It is the fourth highest Electoral College win ever. The first and second wasn't exactly fair competition. It was George Washington who got 100% in the first election that he did when he became our first president, and then his reelection was the second. And then you also have the era of good feelings, James Monroe, the only election, 1820, that's never had an opponent. James Monroe basically won reelection uncontested. And he also wins 60% of the popular vote, which is again the highest since that reelection of James Monroe in the era of good feelings. This will also solidify the base of the Democratic Party. So, again, in the past, the Democratic Party has been the party of the South and the party of the old Confederacy, but now it will have what we call the New Deal Coalition: intellectuals, labor unions, blue collar workers, religious and racial minorities, also urban populations. And for the first time since they've really been able to get the right to vote, African Americans will begin to vote for the Democratic Party heavily because, again, the Democratic Party is offering to help people, even though that help doesn't equally go to Black people and people of color. It is still better than what the Republican Party doing, which is pick yourself up by your own bootstraps. We're not going to help you. Stop being lazy. And so people stop voting for Republicans for a while. And so, because of that, Democrats will maintain large percentages in Congress for the next several decades. They'll control the presidency all the way until the 1950s and enter this period of major Democratic control and a complete realigning of the parties, as the Republicans, formerly the party of African Americans, of the northern industrial cities, now will begin to try to find a new base and try to find a new identity, which will not really come about until the 60s and 70s. Though these laws are fairly important, fairly popular, there is a group that did not like it. That is the Supreme Court, and so they'll strike down a couple of his laws, including the National Recovery Act and the Agriculture Adjustment Act in 35 and 36. And so, even though he has a supermajority in Congress and he's a very popular president, many of the justices in this old Supreme Court are conservative because they have been nominated during a period where Democrats did not have a lot of power. There's only been two Democratic presidents since the end of the Civil War. And so Roosevelt is not happy about this. And so he comes up with this idea. I'm just going to replace some of these justices. I'm going to add in a bunch of new justices, one for every justice over the age of 70, which would allow him to put in six new justices. And for the first time ever, this is when both Congress and the American people said no, that this is too much. You are getting too much power for yourself. This will end up hurting FDR's political reputation. Some will even call him a dictator or wannabe dictator. So you have images like this cartoon here on the left that shows him going up to the seat of dictator. You also have this image here where he appears to be operating a puppet court called the Pat Court. You have Oliver Twist with him asking for more power. And it's become it was such a huge thing that actually we have not tried to expand the court since 1937 when he suggested this. And in the following years, a number of these conservative justices will retire and they will side with FDR in a couple important cases. And so he will drop his plans to alter the court. But it is one of the few things that kind of damages his reputation. And like I said, as I said, was such a huge backlash that no one has tried to expand the court since. As I sort of alluded to earlier, the New Deal wasn't exactly equal. Many of these policies are very helpful for building the white middle class that will become so affluent and well off in the 1950s, but they are almost deliberately designed to exclude black and brown workers. Now, there's a lot of reason for this. Most of it has to do with the traditional base of the Democratic Party being in the old Confederacy. And so Roosevelt knew that he had to cut out black and brown jobs from Social Security and from protections under the National Labor Relations Act in order to get the support of Southern Democrats, which were incredibly necessary for passing all of the New Deal. It also creates public housing, but did not allow African Americans in. So it created segregated public housing. And it's because of these racial barriers in the New Deal that the affluence of the 1950s will be so concentrated among whites, and everybody else will pretty much be excluded. One of the things that provides the most growth and wealth is the ability to have a home. This is part of the American dream. This idea that you can get a job and provide for your family and eventually buy a home and pay it off, and then eventually you can either sell it or pass that down onto your children versus paying rent forever and never getting any sort of that. And so this Federal Housing Administration will deliberately be set up in order to exclude people who are not white. And so many of these loans that are provided by the Federal Housing Administration to people looking for a home will be designed to exclude African Americans, and even neighborhoods that are designated as too African American are considered too risky, so we can't give you a loan. Or um, we also are not going to try to create integrated communities. In fact, the underwriting manual prohibits allowing to people to basically get a home in an area that is predominantly white. So the many African Americans are cut out of these neighborhoods, and you have the growth thanks to the FHA and thanks to the economic prosperity of the 1950s. You have the growth of suburbs, but these suburbs will remain incredibly white and segregated, and it will block many Black and Brown families from being able to access capital and only increase racial inequality. Following World War II, which eventually leads to, of course, the civil rights movement and pushes to help bridge that gap, which have been mostly unsuccessful. But we'll talk about that later. When we talk about the 1950s and the growing wealth gap between white families and families of color. That will be it for chapters 22 or module 4 for History 1302. Thank you and have a good day.